A millionaire, struck by a rare illness, was isolated in his room, and everyone fled. Only the nanny remained and uncovered everything. Eduardo Pontes awoke and couldn't move the right side of his body. His right hand lay there on the Egyptian cotton sheet that cost more than 10 people's monthly wages, but it wouldn't obey. His fingers wouldn't bend, his arm wouldn't lift, and he stared at that hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if someone had swapped his body overnight for one he didn't recognize. He was 32, owner of one of the largest construction companies in Ontario, with a penthouse apartment in downtown Toronto, a sprawling estate in Oakville, and an office on the 20th floor, overlooking the entire city. He had everything money could buy, and on that Tuesday morning, in the absolute silence of the mansion he called home, he discovered that none of it mattered. What no one knew yet, and what you will discover throughout this story, is that this paralysis was not the beginning of Eduardo Pontes's end. It was the beginning of the one thing he had never had in life. But to understand what happened, you need to understand who he was before that day. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below what city you're watching this from right now. This story will captivate you from beginning to end. Eduardo Henrique Pontes had grown up in Toronto in a family of builders. His grandfather had started with a cement mixer and a plot of land in the suburbs. His father had doubled the family's assets. Eduardo had tripled them. By 28, he was the face of Pontes developments in business magazines. By 30, he had closed the largest residential construction contract in the province. By 32, he was the kind of man who walked into a restaurant and found his table already reserved, who made a call and things happened, who didn't need to explain anything to anyone because his surname explained everything. But there was a version of Eduardo that the magazines didn't show. The version that came home at 11 p.m. and didn't notice the lights were out, who sent voice messages to his girlfriend during a meeting and expected her to understand that this was love, who had been dating Fernanda Weiss, the daughter of a Canadian senator, for 3 years, beautiful and accustomed to luxury, and who rarely stayed more than 48 hours in the same place without one of them needing to be somewhere else. There was also the version who avoided his sister. Christiane Pontes was 36. She was an architect and lived in a house in the Annex neighborhood, with her 2 young children, Tay, 5, and Bela, 3. Her husband had left 2 years prior, leaving debt and no explanation. Christiane had rebuilt her life alone, with dignity and without asking her brother for help more than once, because the first time he had taken 3 weeks to respond. It was Christiane who hired Ana. Ana Luisa Santana had arrived in Toronto from a small town in New Brunswick with a backpack and her cousin's address in North York. She had a soft voice, brown eyes that always seemed to be thinking about something she didn't say aloud, and a way of entering a room that didn't disturb the silence. Christiane had hired her as a nanny for Tay and Bela 2 months before Eduardo's illness, after a neighbor's recommendation. Ana worked 6 days a week at Christiane's house, sleeping in the small room in the back, which had a tiny window overlooking a brick wall, a single bed, and a shelf where she had placed 3 books and a photo. The photo was of a 2-year-old boy smiling at the camera with ice cream on his nose. The boy's name was Gabriel, and he had died 2 years earlier of pneumonia, one dawn when Ana didn't have money for a taxi to the hospital and the nearest walk-in clinic was closed. But Eduardo Pontes didn't know this yet. On that Tuesday in August, when he woke up unable to move the right side of his body, Fernanda was sleeping beside him. He tried to speak, and his voice came out strange, slurred, as if his tongue was heavy. Fernanda opened her eyes, looked at him for 2 seconds, then got up and went to the bathroom. When she returned, she already had her cell phone in her hand. "Eduardo, your mouth is crooked." He knew. He felt it. There was a tingling that started behind his right ear and ran down his neck, shoulder, arm, and stopped at his fingertips like static. "Call Marcia," he managed to say. Marcia was his personal assistant. "I'm calling 911, Fernanda said. "No, call Marcia. She knows the right doctors." Fernanda stood still for a moment, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher with half his face numb. Then she took her phone and went into the hallway to speak. In 40 minutes, 2 doctors were in the room. In 2 hours, Eduardo was in a private clinic in a posh Toronto district, undergoing tests that cost what most people earned in a year. In 6 hours, he had a preliminary diagnosis that neither doctor wanted to pronounce aloud the first time. Susak syndrome, a rare autoimmune disease that attacked the small blood vessels of the brain, retina, and inner ear. Progressive, unpredictable, with no known definitive cure. The doctors spoke of treatment, corticosteroids, immunosuppressants, the need for absolute rest, and constant monitoring. Eduardo heard the words, but they arrived as if they were being spoken to someone else. He was 32. He had 3 construction projects underway. He had a meeting with investors the next day. Fernanda stayed with him that night. The next day, she stayed in the morning. The day after, she called saying she had a severe headache. On the 4th day, her belongings were no longer in the bathroom. There was no conversation, no long phone call. There was a text message that read, "Eduardo, I truly wish you the best, but I can't be the person you need right now. Sorry." Eduardo read the message 3 times, then placed the phone on his nightstand and stared at the ceiling. Cristiane arrived that afternoon with Te and Bella and entered her brother's room with a heavy heart. She knew about the illness, knew Fernanda had left, knew Eduardo's partners had already called an emergency meeting to discuss company management during his absence, and she stood by her brother's bed, not knowing what to say. First, Te, 5, entered the room without asking permission. He climbed onto the bed with the agility of children who haven't yet learned that there are places you shouldn't enter, and sat beside Eduardo, looking at him with those big eyes he had inherited from his father. "Uncle, are you really sick? Or pretend sick?" "Really," Eduardo said, his voice still slightly slurred. "Mom says when we're really sick, we get scared. Are you scared?" Eduardo didn't answer for a moment. No one had asked that question. The doctors had asked about symptoms. Marcia had asked about power of attorney. The partners had asked about medical reports. No one had asked if he was scared. "Yes," he said. Te placed his small hand on Eduardo's inert arm with the seriousness of children who sometimes understand more than any adult and said, "It's okay. Ana stays when we're scared." And that's how Eduardo Pontes learned that there was an Ana. Cristiane needed to return home with the children and didn't want to leave her brother alone with the nurse he had dismissed on the 2nd day because she made too much noise walking. She was in the hallway outside the room, speaking softly on the phone, when the front door opened and Ana appeared with the children clinging to her. Eduardo saw her from the bed, through the crack of the half-open door. She had her hair tied in a loose bun, a faded blue blouse, and one of the children, little Bela, asleep on her shoulder. She spoke softly with Cristiane and swayed her body back and forth, with the automatic rhythm of someone accustomed to the weight of a sleeping child. He couldn't hear what the two were saying, but he saw Cristiane point toward his room and saw Ana look briefly in that direction with an expression that wasn't pity, wasn't curiosity, wasn't that uncomfortable look everyone else had when they saw Eduardo Pontes sick. It was just attention, as if she were cataloging a fact. "She's staying here tonight," Cristiane said, entering the room. "I need to sort something out early tomorrow with the lawyer, and I won't be able to come before noon. Ana will look after the children and can help you if you need anything." "I don't need a nanny," Eduardo said. "I know you don't need a nanny. You need someone who isn't a robot and who won't look at you as if you're going to die." He didn't answer. Cristiane left. The children went to sleep in the guest rooms, and the mansion fell into a silence. Eduardo knew well that silence he had always thought was peace, but that night sounded different. It sounded empty. At 11:30 p.m., he heard light footsteps in the hallway. The bedroom door was ajar, and through the gap, he saw the light turn on in the kitchen. Then, he heard the gentle sound of a small pan on the stove, a spoon stirring slowly, and a smell that took a few seconds to identify. Chamomile tea with honey and ginger. Ana appeared at the bedroom door with a mug in her hands and gently knocked on the wood. "Are you awake, sir?" "Yes," he said. And then, because he felt he needed to establish some territory, "You can call me Eduardo." She entered, placed the mug on the nightstand, silently, and left without another word. He stared at the mug for a while, then drank. It was the best tea he had ever had in his life, and that irritated him in a way he couldn't explain to himself. In the following days, a routine established itself in a way Eduardo hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. Cristiane came in the morning, stayed a few hours, sorted out what she needed to. Ana stayed with the children, fed them, put them to sleep, and sometimes appeared in Eduardo's room with something he needed but hadn't asked for. The medication on time, a glass of water, the window open because the afternoon sun on that side made the room too hot. He never called her. She simply appeared. On the 5th day, Eduardo lost his patience. "How do you know when I need something if I don't call?" Ana was adjusting the window curtain. She turned slowly. "I pay attention," she said simply. "To what?" "To the sounds. When Eduardo turns over with effort, it's because the position is uncomfortable. When your breathing changes, it's because something is hurting. When you're quiet in a different kind of quiet than your usual quiet, it's because you're thinking about something that's not right." He stared at her. Where did you learn that? She paused. A small, almost imperceptible pause, the kind that goes unnoticed by those not paying attention. But Eduardo, who had spent the last 5 days with nothing to do but observe people, noticed. With my son, she said, and said nothing more. He didn't ask yet. On the 7th day, Tay ran into the room with a drawing. It was a figure of a man lying in a bed with a smaller figure beside him. Clearly Anna, by the messy bun Tay, had tried to represent with scribbles in all directions. And below, in large, uneven letters of a 5-year-old, I stay with you. Eduardo looked at the drawing for a long time. Do you want me to put it there? Tay asked, pointing to the wall opposite the bed. Yes, Eduardo said. And Tay went to get tape with the seriousness of someone on an important mission. He returned and taped the drawing with 4 generous pieces of tape to the wall opposite Eduardo's bed. Then he stepped back, evaluated his work, approved it with a nod, and ran out. Eduardo looked at the drawing for a while after Tay left. He stayed and saw. He saw that there was a bed in the drawing and 2 characters. But the room around them was a colorful mess of windows and flowers and stars that Tay had added for no apparent reason, just because he thought the room would look better that way. He saw that the small figure beside the bed had open hands towards the larger figure, in a gesture Tay had probably copied from something he'd seen in real life. He saw that Anna, according to Tay, stayed by his side, with open hands. And he thought, when was the last time someone stayed by my side without wanting anything in return? He couldn't remember. On the 10th day, Eduardo had his first nocturnal crisis. He woke up at 2 a.m. with a headache that felt like someone was driving a nail behind his right eye, accompanied by ringing in his ear and spatial disorientation that made him clutch the edge of the bed, not knowing for a moment where he was. He tried to grab his phone, and the phone fell to the floor. He tried to sit up, and his balance failed. Before he could think what to do, the bedroom door opened. Anna had left the door of the small room where she slept Ahar, and Eduardo's room too. She appeared in 30 seconds, barefoot, in her pajama top and wrinkled pants, like someone who sleeps dressed, and without a word, went to the bed. She turned on the small nightstand lamp, not the ceiling light, which would be too bright, and placed her cool hand on Eduardo's forehead. I'm here, she said. Tell me what you're feeling. Head, he managed to say. And your ear? Both sides or just the right? Right. Has it happened before? No, not like this. She picked up the phone from the floor, unlocked it with the password Christian had given her for emergencies, and called the on-call doctor. While waiting for the call to be answered, she put her arm behind Eduardo's back with a firmness that contrasted with her size and helped him into a more reclined position, without agitating his neck. He felt the warmth of her arm behind his back. It wasn't a nurse's touch. It was a person's touch. There was a difference he couldn't explain, but his entire body recognized it. The doctor gave instructions over the phone. Anna followed each one precisely, adjusted the pillow, retrieved the crisis medication, returned with water in a glass that she held while he drank, because his right hand still trembled. She sat in the chair beside the bed until 4 a.m. when the pain subsided enough for him to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, the chair was empty, and there was a note on a small pad on the nightstand. The handwriting was small and careful. Doctor says you might need to adjust dose. Call doctor. Carla at 8, she confirms at 10. Medication on the table, water on the nightstand. Tay and Bella have already had breakfast. Eduardo Pontes read the note twice, and then did something he hadn't done in a long time. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, without picking up his phone, without turning on the television, without doing absolutely anything, and thought. He thought of Fernanda, who had disappeared with a text message. He thought of his partners who called only to talk about power of attorney and medical reports. He thought of Marcia, who was efficient and cold as a calculator. He thought of all the circles of his life, the circle of money, the circle of status, the circle of events and magazines and meetings, and realized that none of them had sent anyone to his room at 2 a.m. The one who had come to the room was a woman who earned a nanny's salary and slept in a small room with a window overlooking a brick wall. How had he reached that point? That afternoon, when Anna came in to leave lunch on a tray she had prepared, because Eduardo said the delivery food made him sick, she asked the question she had held back for 10 days. You said you learned to pay attention like that with your son. Where is he? Anna stopped. She was facing away from him, arranging the tray. She stood still for 2, 3, 4 seconds. Then she turned slowly, and he saw in her expression something he recognized because he had seen it few times in his life, but never forgot. It was the expression of someone deciding whether to tell the truth or to deflect. She told the truth. Gabriel died 2 years ago. He was 2 years and 3 months old. The room fell silent. Pneumonia, she continued, her voice low and even, like someone who has been through pain so many times that they've learned not to let it explode, only to let it seep out slowly. I came to Toronto because I couldn't stay in the same place where he had lived, she said. Every corner of that small town in New Brunswick was him. The street we walked on, the small grocery store where I bought his milk. I needed to leave. She looked directly at him. So, that's it. I learned to pay attention to a sick child because that's what I had. Now I use what I learned to care for those who need it. Eduardo Pontes, who had managed multi-million-dollar corporate crises without blinking, who had negotiated contracts with international investors without showing any emotion, felt something in his throat he couldn't name. "I'm sorry," he said. And it sounded different from all the times he had said "I'm sorry" in his life. It sounded as if that word had weight this time. Anna nodded slightly. "No need, just eat while it's warm," and left. He ate. For the first time in days, he ate with attention. In the days that followed, something changed between them in a way neither of them named, but both felt. There was no longer the awkward silence of employer and employee. There was a different silence. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have already said the important things and don't need to fill the air. Anna began to stay in the room after leaving lunch, sometimes sitting in the chair reading a book while he slept or watched something with low volume on his phone. Eduardo began to speak, not about the company, not about money, but about things that had long found no space. The memory of his grandfather taking him to construction sites on Saturdays and teaching him to feel the quality of concrete by its texture. The feeling he had at 17 when he visited the first apartment the family built and saw a real family moving in. "That's why I wanted to build," he said one afternoon, "to see people moving into homes. I don't remember when I stopped going to inaugurations." "Why did you stop?" he thought. "Because I stopped looking? It got too big and I stopped looking at people." Anna didn't answer. But there was a quality to the way she listened, motionless, with total attention, without her phone in hand, that made his words sound different from how they sounded when he thought them. On the 15th day, Christiana arrived with an expression Eduardo recognized from childhood. It was the expression she had when she knew something and was deciding whether to tell. "What is it?" he asked, as soon as she entered. She closed the door, looked at the bed where he was sitting, already with more mobility in his right arm, but still with an unsteady gait. She sat in the chair. "I went to the doctor yesterday." "No, my doctor, the geneticist Dr. Hator recommended." Eduardo remained quiet. "Susak syndrome has a genetic component in some cases. Did you know? They mentioned it." "Eduardo," she took a deep breath. Dad knew. The silence that settled in the room was different from all other silences. "What did you say?" "I found it in his papers when I did the estate settlement last year. I didn't understand what it was at the time. It was a report from 2019 made in a private clinic in Ottawa. The name of the syndrome was there. There was a handwritten note with a doctor's name and written, 'Do not tell Eduardo.'" Eduardo Pontes looked at his sister for a time she couldn't measure. "He knew," Eduardo said slowly, "and he didn't tell me. I think he didn't want to scare you, or didn't want it to interfere with the business. You know how he was? I know how he was. Their father had died 3 years earlier of a heart attack. They had had a relationship of respect and distance, like two men who worked well together, but never learned to talk about anything else. Eduardo had taken over the company without properly grieving because there were projects underway and contracts to sign, and the company couldn't stop. He had buried his father and returned to work the following week. Now he discovered that his father had carried a secret about his son's health and chose to take it to the grave. "You should have told me when you found it," Eduardo said. "I know. I made a mistake too. I'm sorry." It was the second time in 15 days that Eduardo heard an "I'm sorry" that had weight, and this time it was different because it came from his sister and because there were years of accumulation behind that word. That night, Eduardo couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark thinking about his father, thinking about the report, thinking about the years he had worked without knowing what he carried in his blood. Years in which he had pushed his body to the limit because he never imagined that a limit could truly exist. Years in which he had said no to things that now seemed important and yes to things that now seemed empty. At 3 a.m., he heard a soft noise in the hallway. Footsteps. The door opened. Anna appeared with the hallway light behind her, creating an outline of light around her figure. "You're not sleeping?" she said. It wasn't a question. She entered, closed the door, turned on the small lamp, and sat in the chair. She didn't ask what was wrong. She sat there in silence for a moment and then said, "When I found out Gabriel was sick the night I took him to the hospital, I looked at him there in his small bed and thought, I should have noticed sooner. 2 days before, he had a cough. I thought it was flu and gave him Tylenol and told him to sleep. I spent 2 years thinking about what I could have done differently." Eduardo looked at her. "You did what you could. That's what people say," she said. "But our minds don't accept it easily." She paused. "Are you thinking about a mistake that wasn't yours?" He told her about his father's report, about the handwritten note, about the "Do not tell Eduardo" written in his father's handwriting, which he would recognize anywhere. Anna listened to everything without interrupting. When he finished, she remained quiet for a moment and then said, "He made a mistake." "That's true. But I think he was scared. People hide things when they're afraid to see the suffering of those they love. He didn't love me that way. Perhaps he didn't know how to love any other way," she said. "There are many people like that. They love wrongly because they never learned the right way." Eduardo stared at the ceiling. "Me too," he said. "I loved wrongly. Or didn't love at all, I don't know which. The difference is that you can still learn." And it was at that moment, in that silent early morning, in that room that had started as a prison and was becoming something else, that Eduardo Pontes felt for the first time in a long time, something he couldn't solve with money, couldn't delegate to Marcia, couldn't protocol in a board meeting. He felt that he wanted to stay awake beside that woman until daybreak. He didn't say any of this, but they both stayed awake until 5 a.m., talking and in silence, alternating between the two. And when the light began to filter through the window, neither of them had noticed the time passing. "You should sleep," Anna said, getting up. "Anna," she stopped. "Thank you," he said. She stood at the door for a second, with the outline of morning beginning behind her. "I'm the one who thanks you," she said softly. "It's been a long time since I've talked to someone like this," and left. Eduardo stared at the closed door for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and slept the most peaceful sleep he had had in weeks. In the following weeks, Eduardo's recovery was slow and non-linear, as the doctor had warned it would be. There were good days when he could walk down the hallway with minimal assistance and sit on the veranda, looking at the garden for hours. There were bad days when his head hurt, his ear rang, and the light bothered him, and he lay there unable to do anything. Anna was there on both types of days. On good days, she took the children to the garden. And sometimes, Eduardo would go there and sit in an armchair, watching Teches Bella and listening to the sound children make, that sound that has no name, but is different from all other sounds in the world. Sometimes, Anna would sit on the other side of the garden table, and they would stay there without needing to talk. And there was something in that silence that Eduardo couldn't name, but that his body recognized as something important. On bad days, she appeared uncalled, did what needed to be done, and before leaving the room, he always said the same thing, softly, with the naturalness of someone saying good morning, without ceremony, without expecting a response. "I'm here." It was the simplest phrase he had ever heard, and it was the phrase he most needed to hear. On the 23rd day, the storm came. Fernanda Weiss, who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier with a text message, appeared at the house with a suitcase and a bouquet of flowers. Eduardo was on the veranda when Marcia called to notify him. He looked at the garden for a moment, then said, "Tell her to come in." Fernanda was different, or perhaps Eduardo was different, because she looked exactly the same as always, and something about that bothered him in a way he couldn't explain at the time. "Eduardo," she said. "I was horrible, I know. I panicked and left, and that was cowardly." He listened. "I love you," she continued. "I just got scared. I'd never been through this, but I'm here now. Can I stay?" He looked at her for a while. There was a bouquet of white roses on the small table between them, expensive flowers bought from a florist he himself had frequented a few times. Fernanda was beautiful, as she always was, with her hair styled, the right clothes, and the perfume he knew. And he realized as he looked at her that he was feeling nothing. Not anger, not longing, not relief, nothing. "Fernanda," he said, "you left with a text message when I couldn't move my arm. I know, it was terrible of me. It's been 3 weeks. I spent nights awake in pain. And where were you?" She remained quiet. "No need to answer," he said, "because it doesn't matter where you were. What matters is that I spent 3 weeks discovering what truly matters, and you are not part of it." "Eduardo, it's not anger," he said, and as he said it, he realized it was true. "It's just that I'm not the same person you left, and what I need is not what you have to offer." Fernanda left. The flowers remained on the table. Anna picked them up later to place in a vase in the hallway, without commenting, without asking. But when she passed Eduardo's room, with the vase of white flowers in her arms, and that expression of someone thinking more than they would say, he called her. Anna, she stopped. Do you know what I feel for you? She stood at the door with the vase of white flowers in her arms, and that expression of someone thinking more than they would say. Yes, she said softly. And you? A pause. I know what I feel, but there are many differences between us. There are, he agreed. And none of those things change what you were to me these 23 days. Eduardo, you're sick, you're vulnerable. Sometimes we confuse things. I spent my entire life confusing status with worth, confusing presence with love, confusing a busy schedule with a good life. But these 23 days were the most honest of my life, and you were the most honest person I've ever had by my side. Anna said nothing for a moment, looked at the vase in her hands, then looked at him. I'm scared. Of what? Of needing you. I've already lost everything I needed once. I don't know if I can do it again. He stared at her and said, the truest thing he had ever said in his life. I'm scared too, but I've learned here that fear is not a reason to leave. It's a reason to stay. The vase of white flowers remained in Eduardo's room from that day on. In the months that followed, Eduardo Ponte's life reorganized in a way no one around him had predicted. He called a meeting with his partners, not to discuss power of attorney or temporary leave, but to propose a complete restructuring of the company. He no longer wanted to be the sole decision-making center. He wanted to build a structure that would work with or without him, because he had learned the hard way that life doesn't warn you when it's going to change direction. In one of the meetings, one of the oldest partners, Reinaldo Meireles, said in front of everyone that Eduardo's illness had affected his judgment, that a man who had completely changed his way of thinking about the business in 2 months probably wasn't in a condition to make strategic decisions. Eduardo listened carefully, then said, Reinaldo, you're right that I've changed. What you're calling affected judgment, I call clarity. The difference is that I almost had to lose my arm to see what you will never need to see, because you'll never have the courage to stop. Reinaldo left the meeting without answering. Eduardo restructured the company, hired 2 new directors, delegated what he had centralized for years, and on mornings when he could, he went to the construction sites, not to supervise, but to see people working, to see the concrete rising, and imagine the families who would live there. He had forgotten this for a long time. He didn't want to forget again. With Anna, things happened slowly, as she had asked, as she needed, as it was right for them to happen. She continued to be Tay and Bela's nanny. She continued to sleep in the small room with a window overlooking the brick wall, but now the wall had a climbing vine that Tay had planted with Eduardo's help one Saturday afternoon when the 3 of them had gone out into the garden. And Eduardo had dug the earth with his left hand, because his right still wasn't obeying properly. And Tay had solemnly declared that the plant would grow to cover the entire wall, and that he would call it John. The plant grew. Tay called it John. Eduardo and Anna began to do what they had never done. They went out, not to expensive restaurants, not to events, not to the places Eduardo's old life frequented. They went to the Sunday morning farmer's market, where Anna bought the herbs she used for teas, and Eduardo carried the bag and listened to her explain what each one was for in that soft voice he had learned to recognize from meters away. They went to the park, where Tay and Bela ran, and the 2 of them sat on a bench drinking coffee from a thermos that Anna brought, because the kiosk coffee, she had once said, tasted like nothing. One October afternoon, 2 months after the conversation on the veranda with the vase of flowers, Eduardo stood in the market, watching her as she chose tomatoes with the concentration of someone solving a complex problem, and felt that thing in his chest that is difficult to name because it is so many things at once. Calm and urgency, familiar and new, certainty and also a little vertigo. She turned and caught him looking. What is it? She said. Nothing, he said. And then, because he had learned not to let important things pass, I'm thinking I want to keep doing this thing here with you. She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the tomatoes. These ones are good, she said, but she was smiling. It was the first time Eduardo had seen that full smile, and it was enough. 2 years later, on a May morning, Eduardo Pontes walked down the hallway of the house with a cane. The doctor had said that with time and the right treatment, there was a good chance of progressive recovery, and he had been right. His right arm had returned to 90% of its capacity. His gait had improved. The crises had decreased in frequency and intensity. He walked down the hallway at the pace he had learned to have, without rushing, paying attention to each step. From the veranda, came the sound of children. Te had turned 7 and had developed a theory according to which it was possible to jump from the garden wall to the grass without needing the stairs. A theory that Bela, 5, enthusiastically supported, despite not having the courage to execute it. Anna was on the veranda with them, sitting in a chair with a book on her lap that she probably wasn't reading because her attention was on the children. Eduardo stopped at the veranda door and watched for a moment before entering. There was a scene there that he had never imagined would exist in his life. Noise and light and grass and children and a woman with windswept hair who had arrived from a small town in New Brunswick with a backpack and enormous pain and had stayed when everyone else left. Anna turned and saw him standing at the door. "I'm taking my time," he said. "I see," she said, without urgency, without reproach. He crossed the veranda with his cane and went to sit beside her. Bela immediately abandoned Te's theory about the wall and came to jump into Eduardo's lap with the ease of children who know they are welcome. Te followed soon after, with a twig he had found in the garden, and which, according to him, was definitely from a magical plant. "It's a branch from John," Te said with authority. "Doesn't John have magical branches?" "Yes, he does. I planted him." "I know." Anna laughed. It was a soft, inward laugh. The kind of laugh that doesn't perform, that just happens. Eduardo turned his face to look at her, and she was looking at Te with that total attention that was the most constant thing about her. He placed his hand over hers on the chair. She didn't move. They stayed like that, in the May morning sun, on that veranda, while Te explained his theory of John's magic branch, with a seriousness the matter clearly deserved. At one point, between Te's explanation of the branch's properties and Bela's protest that she also wanted a magic branch, Anna turned her face to Eduardo and said softly, "Just for him, are you okay?" And Eduardo Pontes, who had spent 32 years building a life where no one needed to ask that, because everything on the outside seemed perfect, answered with the simple truth that it took a rare illness, a night of crisis, a report, hidden by his father, and 23 days beside a woman from New Brunswick to learn to say, "I truly am." Anna nodded, turned back to the children, and her hand remained beneath his. Sometimes the people who change our lives don't arrive announced, don't arrive in moments of triumph, don't arrive when we have everything, don't arrive when the path is clear and the light is good. They arrive in the early hours of a crisis, with chamomile tea and careful handwriting on a small notepad. They arrive when the right side of the body doesn't obey and everyone else has left. They arrive and they stay. And sometimes, that's everything. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what city you're watching from. Tell me where those who follow these stories come from, and send this video to someone who needs to hear that some people stay.